So it's very gai chroesawu chi gyd yma, dwi falch iawn o'ch gweld chi. O rai mi ddeud rhywbeth yn Gymraeg, wrth gwrs, gan bod ni yng Nghymru, ond mi fydd y cyfarfod yma yn Saesneg. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this meeting. I've explained to my Welsh-speaking friends that obviously the meeting is going to be in English. We tried to arrange this, didn't we, Andrew, months ago, to be honest. And of course, it's an unfortunate day, if you like, today, because it's a historical day. And Neil Schofield News did write an article for Wales.Cymru, and as we've sort of adopted it really as our sort of article. And can I just sum up in one paragraph really? The attack on Ukraine is an attack on every European. The European Union remains the most successful peace project in modern history. The values of the EU set out in the Lisbon Treaty of democracy, internationalism and freedom of expression. Those are the values that aggression against Ukraine violates. And we'll bear that in mind as I invite Andrew to address the meeting.
Well, it's great to be with you this evening. As Gareth said, it's a very somber day for Europe, but all the more reason to meet, because it's a somber day for Europe, but a day when it's absolutely necessary to consider the strength of Europe and what we do to see that days like this don't recur. As that statement you just read, Gareth, is excellent. It's absolutely spot on. The European Union is the best peace project, not only in the history of Europe, quite possibly in the history of the world, actually, as an actual project focused on maintaining peace between states which had long-standing rivalries and for most of their previous existence had barely gone for a decade without some minor or major war. And as we know, over the previous century, major wars which destroyed largely what we think of as Western civilization. So it's great that we are meeting this evening so we can discuss it and what its implications are. And I'm really delighted to see such a good turnout and so many friends. It's great that Jackie, you're the chair of Wales for Europe, is with us too. It's good to welcome Joe McDonald, your new organiser, who I know is already making an impact, and I see other friends on the call too. So let me start with the Ukraine, which obviously is the issue on all our minds, and then bring my remarks back home to what it means for Britain and Britain's relationship with Europe at large, and where we as a European movement go in terms of our own campaigning step by step towards rejoin, which is the mantra and the strategy which our council, after long deliberations, has adopted. And what we now need to do is to put a proper campaigning strategy behind it so that we can make it happen, which is what we all want to see. And the events today in Ukraine make the imperative for that to happen greater than ever. Now, on Ukraine, it is obviously the case that we need maximum European solidarity and action in the face of what is essentially a fascist dictatorship that is seeking to ride roughshod over the democracy of Ukraine in much the same way as in the 1930s, the fascist dictatorships of Europe sought to do the same with democracies on their border too. William Hague, who was Foreign Secretary for the first half of the last decade, in a very good article in the Times a few weeks ago, said that the only substantive threat to Russian security is independent and free peoples on its border. And that is what Putin objects to, which is manifestly true. That no Western state, members of either NATO or the EU, have either attacked Russia or shown any belligerent intent whatever towards Russia. On the contrary, all of the efforts have been to try and engage Russia, including in shared defense architecture, including possibility in the early days after Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, actually include Russia in within NATO. I am a member of the Council of Europe. I'm one of the British Parliament's representatives in the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe includes Russia because we brought Russia in the 1990s. Of course, Russia doesn't even begin now to observe the principles of the European Convention on Human Rights. In the last meeting that we had in Strasbourg, the major debate was about the imprisonment of Navalny, the leader of the opposition in Russia, who, as you know, as soon as he got back to Moscow, after having been in Germany for emergency medical treatment because of an attempt, almost certainly by the Russian state, to poison him, the first thing that happened was he was arrested on trumped-up charges, and he's just been this week in the shadow of the Ukrainian invasion, been sentenced to 10 years in jail, apparently, for no meaningful crimes whatever. I mean, trumped up tax evasion and all that, which of course is always the stuff of dictators. So it went badly wrong. And the reason it went badly wrong is because Russia failed to become a proper democracy and instead lurched towards an old-style dictatorship. Run by a dictator who was a KGB agent, who never embraced democracy from the outset of his rule, was a strong man who increasingly defined himself by aggression against his neighbours as a means of whipping up a nationalist fervour at home as he suppressed more and more democracy, the remnants of representative institutions in Russia, and as the Russian economy got worse too, because apart from its energy exports, there isn't much left of the Russian economy, and the Russian economy is now about the size of Spain's. The problem is it's an economy the size of Spain, but military forces the size of Britain and France, including nuclear weapons, which is what makes the whole thing so problematic. Now, there's a debate about whether we're right to expand the EU and NATO to incorporate the new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. It's my view, there may be people on the call who disagree, but it's my view that what's happened today in Ukraine gives the complete justification and necessity for doing so. Because the idea that Putin and this aggressive, expansionist, fascist dictatorship, which is essentially trying to rewind the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, the idea that he would have been better disposed to the Baltic states, which have very large Russian minorities, to Poland and to other East European states, because they were neutral and weren't members of NATO or the EU, is, to my mind, a complete fallacy. Indeed, part of the reason we're in the Ukrainian crisis, in my view, is because for perfectly good and understandable reasons, and we look back on it, not least the fact that the Ukrainian government itself kept oscillating between pro and anti-Russian presidents, not least because of the suborning of Ukrainian institutions and elections by Russian money and Russian oligarchs, which has been a constant problem undermining their democracy for the last 20 years. But it's my view that if Ukraine had been in the EU and NATO, I don't think that Putin would have dared invade, and I don't think he would dare invade a NATO or EU member, because Article 5 of the NATO treaty and the certainty that this would provoke self-defense measures on behalf of the whole of NATO in defense of any country that did it. So it's my view that what the Ukrainian crisis shows was the absolute necessity for freedom in Central Eastern Europe to be accompanied by them freely entering the two most important Western institutions of prosperity and defense, namely the EU and NATO. And of course, the crucial thing to understand is that they chose to do so. This wasn't an imperial act by us. On the contrary, the process of them joining both the EU and NATO was very long drawn out, and in almost all cases took more than a decade to do, and it involved repeated acts of affirmation by the relevant parliaments of the countries concerned and their governments. And if that hadn't happened, then they wouldn't have been admitted. This was the act of free peoples and free nations and free political institutions. And it's my view that it would have been completely wrong and against the tide of European democracy and freedom for us to have denied their right to join these pan-European institutions for what would only have been a cause of appeasing a Russian leader, who is now increasingly clear is a megalomaniacal dictator. So I think we did the right thing there. The issue now, of course, is how we respond to the Ukrainian crisis to prevent it having wider consequences and hopefully over time to restore Ukrainian sovereignty over their own country. And broadly speaking, the steps which the West is taking, I think, are correct. They are significant economic sanctions. We can discuss whether they're significant enough at the moment, but they're moving in the right direction. It's important to note that by far the biggest economic sanction taken so far has been taken by Germany, who's been criticised, including by Boris Johnson, for not being robust enough. But actually, by far the most robust measure that's been taken in this crisis was Chancellor Scholz's decision yesterday, immediately after the invasion, to cancel Nord Stream 2, which is going to put enormous pressure on German energy supplies. That's, of course, the reason why Nord Stream 2 was contracted in the first place. And it's very notable this has been done by a coalition, a three-party coalition in Germany of the SPD, the Greens, and the Liberals, parties which are not belligerent expansionist parties at all. They're on the centre and the left of German politics. And the German energy minister, who did all the work to see that the step could be taken immediately, and the German foreign minister, who announced it, are both Greens. So you couldn't get a less militaristic or expansionist government than the one you've got in Germany at the moment. And it's taken this bold step because it understands that unless Germany does stand shoulder to shoulder with its Western allies in defense of democracy and the repelling of a brutal invasion violating all international norms, treaties, including treaties specifically relating to Ukraine that Putin entered into, the Minsk II Accords, which specifically provided for the integration on a fair basis, including autonomy of Donbass and the Russian the provinces of eastern Ukraine that have large Russian populations, which is ripped up completely as part of the invasion in the last 2 days. For all of those reasons, Germany has acted decisively, and I regret on this that our Prime Minister, who we obviously want maximum national solidarity, has chose to criticise the Germans. I think that was completely the wrong move. We should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them. We should respect the decisions they've taken, and we now need to take very bold decisions about the thing over which we have control, which is London's status as one of the main means by which Russian oligarchs associated with Putin get their money out of Russia and launder it. I mean, London, as everyone who knows about flows of international illicit flows, London is the single most important location of Russian oligarchical money. And so far, the measures which Boris Johnson has announced, I don't think go far enough, and we need to be really bold and match what the Germans have done. On the wider European implications, this is what's happened over the last 2 days is a massive, massive vindication of the European Union, a massive vindication, bringing the European states together to concentrate on trade, prosperity, and democracy, and the protection of their vital security interests. So the EU and NATO going hand in hand. That was precisely to deal with an eventuality which we thought was remote, but alas turned out to be far less remote than we realized, of the resurgence, even after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, of dictatorship and aggression on Europe's borders. And there's no doubt whatsoever combined effects of the EU in massively boosting the prosperity of its participant nations, and thereby and through its relationship with NATO, which most members of the EU also belong to, strengthening its security was absolutely the right move. As your statement, which is brilliant, says, the European Union is the best peace project in the history of Europe, and it's completely vindicated by what's happened in Ukraine. And as I say, to my mind, the only issue of regret is that it wasn't possible to incorporate Ukraine itself, which might have prevented this catastrophe. What does this all mean for our debate on Britain and Europe? Well, of course, Britain's relationship with Europe never was solely about the European Union. And what the events of the last few weeks, and particularly the last few days, have shown is that even as we're outside the European Union, we need maximum cooperation, engagement, and partnership with our European allies. There are only two substantial military powers in Europe, Britain and France, and we both need to see ourselves as essentially European defence powers. Now, that is the attitude that we've taken as a nation, even under this Brexit government. As I say, my criticism of the Brexit government is that because it's trying to justify Brexit, it's too ready to criticise our European partners, which I think is a big, big mistake, because the one thing that Putin wants above all is to divide the West and divide Western countries. And we absolutely shouldn't play that game, and to make cheap and jibes about France and Germany in the face of one of the worst acts of aggression in the post-war history of Europe, I think is well below the level of events. But for those of us who always opposed leaving the European Union, it's a massive vindication of our position too, because nothing has done more to weaken the European Union than Britain's departure from it. And a weakening European solidarity is a gift to Putin and those outside who want to attack us. It's also, of course, weakened ourselves. You know, I mean, there's this Brexit Opportunities Unit, which was set up, remember, by Lord Frost. You may remember, those of you who've been following my repartee with Lord Frost in the House of Lords, I volunteered to, for no salary at all, to become its director. I said I would do it for nothing. I said, but my first step, if I got it, would be to seize the most important opportunity of Brexit, which is to reapply to rejoin the customs union and the single market, and then the European Union itself. I'm afraid to tell you, I didn't even get an interview on that job. I sent that covering letter in with my CV to Lord Frost. Well, now we've got Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's now the Minister for Brexit Opportunities. The Minister for Brexit Opportunities. This is the guy who, remember, told us it would be 50 years before we could see any benefits of Brexit. And what was he reduced to do, since he can't demonstrate any advantages of Brexit at all? Last week, in an article in The Sun, he asked readers to write in with their suggestions, because he hasn't got any. And he said he would look at them favourably. Well, I'm looking, Michael Heseltine, our brilliant president, has written to him an open letter, which is going to be in The Guardian tomorrow. He hopes that he'll publish the list of the opportunities of Brexit, which readers of The Sun send in, so we can properly evaluate them. Jacob Rees-Mogg himself made a suggestion yesterday as to what an opportunity of Brexit might be. He'd made two suggestions, actually. The first was that we could remove all checks on goods coming into the border, including vital security checks and veterinary checks. Well, that was slapped down by Number 10 within minutes of him saying it. And the other was that we should consider returning to imperial units and measurements. Well, you know, that idea had never crossed my mind, that we might start moving to pre-1970 units, which make it so much harder for us to trade, not just with Europe, but with every other country in the world, which, so far as I'm aware, has metric forms of units for measuring goods and other things. And of course, as I pointed out on Twitter yesterday, since I couldn't resist it, they were called imperial measures for a reason, because they went hand in hand with an empire. Well, the empire doesn't exist anymore. So, I mean, apart from arguably the relationship between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So what precisely is Jacob going to do to see that these have wide international recognition? Is he going to have to reconquer all the countries of the empire? So at least there's a part of the world which would actually recognize these units when we introduce them. The truth is, it's a farce, and it would be funny if it weren't so dangerous and so soul destroying, really, in terms of our economy, our way of life, the opportunities for our young people who are being denied the opportunities to forge careers and to travel freely across their own continents and so on. So with each passing day of Brexit, our resistance to Brexit is more justified, and our campaign to move step by step towards rejoin becomes more necessary. And that campaign needs to take two forms. It needs lots of local campaigning, all the stuff which you're so good at doing on the street stalls and the petitions and so on. And it also needs our national voice to get stronger too. And the single most important way of doing that, in my view, and this is shared by our council and our executive too, is a campaign to massively increase our membership. When we were gearing up to join the European Economic Communities, it then was in the 1960s and 70s, the European movement was a mass organisation. It had been founded by Winston Churchill. Its chair then was Winston Churchill's son-in-law, Duncan Sands. The leaders of all three major political parties in England were presidents of the European movement, which actually happened until John Major, that they were. It's only quite recently that stopped being the case since Brexit came on the scene. And Michael Heseltine, our president, tells me that he thinks we had a few 100,000 members then. We can't find the records, but it was certainly a mass organisation. Well, by 2016 and the referendum, our membership had declined to only 800, which tells you a lot about why Brexit happened. Pro-European movement, the most important one in the country, had totally atrophied, whereas on the other side, of course, we had UKIP with Nigel Farage, tens of thousands of members, which was an important political force in its own right, but also conducting a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party, which, alas, proved so successful. Well, we have now ourselves got to become a mass membership organisation again, because we are only as strong as our members. And that means mass membership in all the constituent parts of the United Kingdom as well. And I know that that's what you're working on in Wales, and we need to do that across the UK. We've got 15,000 members now, which is pretty good. We've doubled our membership in each of the last 2 years, but we need 150,000 members. We need to be a mass organisation. As we become a mass organisation, our campaigning will grow exponentially because we have a much bigger income and many more campaigners locally and nationally, but also we'll then be able to do our own reverse takeover of the political parties, which shouldn't be too hard to accomplish because the opposition parties are all pro-European anyway in terms of their membership, regardless of what some of their leaderships are doing, like Keir Starmer, because they're a bit nervous about putting Brexit back in the centre of the national debate. Most Labour Party members, and this is true of the other opposition parties, are strongly pro-European. And I suspect actually if the tide started turning towards Europe again, and we started reversing the worst aspects of the Boris Johnson Brexit deal, the very hard Brexit taking us out of the customs union and the single market, I suspect quite quickly a strong pro-European movement would develop inside the Conservative Party too. So we've got our work cut out for us in our campaign step by step to rejoin, in what that means in terms of our campaigning week in, week out on the ground and nationally, but also in what we need to do to become a mass membership organisation. And the first big step on that, by the way, is to convert our supporters into members, because we have about 10 times as many supporters as we have members. I don't know how many people you have on mailing lists in North Wales for Europe and Wales for Europe, but it will be many, many thousands. And if they could be converted into members, then, and these are people who've already declared their strong support for the European movement and our work, then that alone would turn us into a mass membership organisation without needing to recruit anybody else at all, because in the process we'd recruit a lot more. So it's really imperative that we do this. And what's happened in the last few days with the Ukraine invasion and crisis demonstrates the utterly central necessity for Britain, the parts of Europe, to be alongside France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the Benelux countries, in the vanguard of the European project of strong cooperation and mutual engagement. And in due course, we need that to take the form of Britain taking its rightful place back in the European Union. So it's great to be with you this evening, and I'd welcome any comments and questions. I think we've got a bit of time for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There is an opportunity now to ask questions. I suppose the easiest way is for people to put their hands up on screen, and that Joe will unmute them. And if there's any dispute, I'll try. Dinah is the first to put a proper hand up. So Dinah, would you like to unmute? There we are, and ask Andrew a question.
Hi, Andrew. It's been a long time since we met in Aberdare Museum, but I
remember it well.
Been following. I always like to start a debate with a controversial question. Way back, and Jackie may be able to help me with this, I was discussing with Derek the fact that there was rumours that there was going to be a European army. And I know that the Tories, people like Bill Cash and cohorts, were very much against that. In 2016, I think I spoke at many, many meetings and said, by God, do we need a European army with Russia and China breathing down everybody's necks? Will NATO do the job? Or was I right to think if we'd stayed in Europe, we could have defended Ukraine with a European army? Thank you.
Well, I hope NATO could do the job. We'll have to wait and see. Of course, NATO, because Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, NATO isn't directly engaged in this conflict. But nor would I think a European army have been either. I very much doubt if there'd been a European army, not least because I don't think Ukraine would have joined it. The same reasons that led Ukraine not to take the decision to join NATO over the last 20 years, though it was in discussions and there were declarations and some, it didn't actually happen, would have applied equally to European army. Can you imagine what Putin would have thought of a European army? He wouldn't have been any more benign to the idea of Ukraine joining a European army than he was to Ukraine joining NATO or the EU. So obviously I agree with you that Europe needs to do more for its own defence, and we need a much, much stronger European pillar of NATO in the first instance. There was, of course, a proposal for a European army at the very beginning of the process of European integration in the 1950s, and it would have happened but for the fact that the French National Assembly narrowly rejected the European Defence Treaty. But it didn't happen. Instead, most of the nations of Western Europe and now Eastern Europe too joined NATO. My view is that for as long as America is prepared to provide a strong security guarantee for Europe, we should take advantage of that. And I think we'd be weaker, particularly with Germany not playing a big part in European defence if that didn't happen. Obviously with Trump, that was highly problematic. And you'll notice that Trump today said that he agreed with Putin. Indeed, the two people who've come out and said they agreed with Putin are Trump and Farage. What does that tell you about the Brexit cause and the problem of the far right in the United States as well? But thank goodness we've got Joe Biden in the White House at the moment, and he's been playing it, I think, absolutely correctly, and has given very strong statements of support for European defence within NATO. So whilst I hope over time we do take more responsibility for our own defence in Europe, I think NATO is doing as good a job in this crisis and will continue to do as a European army and defence arrangement would have done, because we have a very pro-European and constructive President of the United States. But if that weren't the case, and for example, in 2 years' time, Trump would come back again, then I think we would need to think quite quickly about creating specifically European defence institutions.
Thank you for such an excellent answer.
Thank you very much to both of you. I see 4 hands up. I don't know which hands came up first. So I'll ask Ian Jones to unmute himself and ask a question, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I went to the Aberdeen meeting as well a few years ago. I live in Merthyr Tydfil and I work in Blaen y Gwent, and I think Merthyr Tydfil is the second most Leave voting area in Wales, and Blaen y Gwent's the first most Leave voting area in Wales. And I've worked there for the last 10 years. And let me tell you now, after the referendum, nothing has changed. These people, there's no Union Jacks around or brass bands or anything like that. Nothing has changed whatsoever. And I just wonder what these people actually wanted. You know, they've voted for this thing, and there's nothing afterwards. You know, I might even join their cause if they were all gung ho for getting things done and all the rest of it, and Brexit and all the rest of it. But there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing at all that's changed in these areas whatsoever in the last 5 years, in terms of the people who voted Leave. And I just wonder where we go with this. You know, you've got these areas which have voted Leave, but have just left it there. You know, they put their X in the box and walked away. And I just wonder where we go with this. You know, what happens next in these areas?
Well, in terms of the European movement and Wales for Europe, I think we've got to start campaigning in these areas, because part of the reason why we weren't able to reverse Brexit is because and indeed stop Brexit coming through the 2016 referendum, is because our campaigning wasn't strong enough. And particularly in places which had suffered from economic decline and, like the Valleys, deindustrialization over the previous 20 years, no one was really making the arguments for Europe in the face of populists who are arguing that the reason for the local and economic depressions that were taking place in these areas was because of Europe, which was always a lie, of course. There was the deindustrialization of the Valleys had absolutely nothing to do with the European Union whatsoever. It was all to do with, well, the flow of technology and energy trends, but also decisions taken by the British government, and in particular austerity after 2010, which is what decimated so much of the public services in the Valleys and elsewhere in Britain, was a policy choice by a Conservative government. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the European Union. So I think always concentrating on the things that you can control. What we can control in the European movement is how and where we campaign. And we should absolutely be campaigning in the Valleys to make the point that you just made here, which is that things haven't improved in these areas since Brexit, and they were never going to improve, unfortunately, because leaving our largest market and also withdrawing our access to all the structural funds and regional support, which we got from the European Union, and which hasn't been replicated by the British government since we left, was only ever going to worsen economic conditions in these areas. And the right way of dealing with that, nobody has to admit that they're wrong or anything like that in terms of how they voted, but the right way of dealing with it is to move step by step towards rejoin. And we need to make that argument in the Valleys as much as we make it in the Remain.
But people don't talk about it. There was no further for it. No, they went there. Was it June the 23rd, 2006? They put their X in the box, and that was it.
Yes, because they don't talk. Yes, it's true. But because they don't talk about it, doesn't mean that we don't. We shouldn't talk about it, does it? I think we've got to talk about it and make the argument. I think the conspiracy of silence about Brexit, which we've seen, particularly from the leaderships of the political parties, is something we have to break through, because unless we're out there making the arguments, it won't be made at all. Arguments never win by not being made. They only win by being made very powerfully and consistently, and usually by endless repetition. And we haven't even really begun that process yet in terms of our campaign step by step to rejoin, particularly in areas that voted leave in 2016.
No, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got 4 hands up at the moment. Mark Rosenthal from Anglesey, would you like to unmute and ask a question? And then I'll ask the man of the moment, Neil, to follow him, then Eric, and then Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. Can you hear me okay?
Very much so, Mark.
Yep. Good. So, good evening to you. I have just come back from getting knee surgery carried out in Lithuania, which was extremely interesting. It's the second time I've been there for knee surgery because my North Wales Hospital Board is incapable of carrying out any functions that are of much use. And it was fascinating. I spent the first 2 days in Kaunas, and to see how development through European funds in an ex-Russian state is changing, and how it's changed since 2018, the last time I was there, and what it's like today. They've just got a massive science park project. These are the sort of things that we are now missing out on. And I remember in my earlier career, I was doing a lot of work on tip reclamation all over Wales, and the amount of European funding for improving areas in the valleys and South Wales and the development of the A55 in North Wales, all those sort of things have a huge benefit. And what we're desperately lacking especially in North Wales, is the development of infrastructure. How do we get across the point that we have lost the capacity to use the funding that did come through the EU to improve our infrastructure, which is the key point that everyone's complaining about now, in that, you know, the salaries in North Wales are generally so low that nobody can afford to buy a house. So it's always blamed on various things like second homeowners and so on. But really, our problem is we don't have the infrastructure developed to generate decent jobs. So I'd be interested to know how you think we can use examples like Lithuania to expand that concept. The other thing that I did want to say was, in Lithuania, I met a lot of people from English-speaking countries who were having operations. Also met a couple of people from the Ukraine, lovely people. And I think one of the problems that the UK has is that we consider Eastern Europeans as inferior human beings.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Andrew, would you like to respond?
I didn't quite follow that last part, Mark. I don't think we do consider East Europeans to be inferior human beings, do we? I mean, I think probably Putin does, which is part of what's going on at the moment, but I don't think we do we?
Well, I have to say that in talking to a lot of people over the years since I've been going, 2018, people don't really understand that there is equivalent technical skills, there's equivalent infrastructure improvement better than here. The concept is, oh well, it's Europe. It's not as good as the UK.
I think it's certainly true that not much is known about what's going on in large parts of Eastern Europe, and that's partly our fault in the European movement. We haven't done a good enough job of explaining how big a change and transformation there's been, including, as you say, in the infrastructure of Central Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall and their embrace of modernisation and a European destiny. So that's all certainly true. We should certainly be learning from their improvements in infrastructure, as you say. So I agree with all of that. But I don't think that that they're regarded by most people in Western Europe as inferior. They had a lot of economic catching up to do because, of course, they were part of the Soviet Union, which was an economic catastrophe for them, and they were treated as colonies, of course, by Soviet Russia. So there's been quite a lot of economic catching up to do. But as you say, they've done a pretty good job of it, and we should be regarding them as a source of inspiration. And we don't do enough of that at the moment. So I agree with that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Can I go on to, thank you, Mark, for your question. Neil next, please. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Then Eric and then Paul. And I think that'll be the end of the questions.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to pick up on a point that, Andrew, that you were making a bit earlier about what Farage was saying. And today has been a dreadful day in many ways, but I think there's also been a sense of the penny dropping a bit and of the dots being joined about the politics of Brexit, about the Russian money within the Conservative Party, and that the people who are backing Putin are people like Farage and people like Aaron Banks, and then over in the US we've seen people like Bannon and Trump talking about their support for Putin and criticizing NATO expansion. Do you feel that the events today, as well as demonstrating, as you said, the absolute importance of a strong EU, have actually shifted the political game a bit, in the sense that people are beginning to join the dots between the corruption within the Conservative Party, the corruption of Russian money, and the way that Brexit came about through Vote Leave and the the way in which Conservative politicians have responded, really, to the funding from their Russian supporters and from the oligarchs. Are there reasons after today why we might just be a little bit more optimistic that the political debate, as distinct from the economic debate, is moving our way slightly?
Well, thanks for that, Neil, and also huge thanks to all that you do for the European movement, including the statement and the article today. Hugely appreciated. You're also brilliant on social media, so keep it up. I hope you're right. I hope you're right that what's happened today demonstrates the huge dangers of the vote leaves association with Russia. I mean, it's literally flabbergasting that Farage could be saying that his hero today is Putin. I mean, it's literally flabbergasting. And he says that I mean, it's the false equivalence that this requires him to make between the Soviet Union in the past and the European Union today, which is one of his things, is just a breathtaking in its frankly in its idiocy, and it's very dangerous idiocy as well, because it's not just that it's totally wrong, but of course it gives huge succor to Putin and other fellow dictators to know that there are some people who are essentially championing his cause across Europe. So I hope it's a wake-up call. But I think we shouldn't be complacent, and we need to absolutely, day in, day out, make the argument as to how Western security requires, and European security requires, European solidarity, and the supreme form of European solidarity, which has been so successful over the last 70 years, is the European Union itself. And so to proclaim the importance of Western partnership and solidarity, whilst saying that an imperative for you is Brexit, is a fundamental contradiction in terms. It's a fundamental contradiction in terms to talk about the Western Alliance needing to strengthen the Western Alliance, as the government has been saying today, at the same time as saying that we should be prioritising Brexit and hard Brexit. These are just fundamental contradictions, and we need to be saying that loud and clear. I completely agree with you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Eric, I don't know where you're based. I mean, Neil's
I live in Cardiff.
There we are. And then Paul is based in Cardiff as well. So Eric, would you like to, you have unmuted, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Well, I just have a comment. The European Union is supposed to be democratic, but countries like Poland and Hungary don't seem to be very democratic to me. I think the European Court of Justice has just told them that they signed up to be democratic, and so they better be democratic. I mean, don't countries like that sort of undermine the principle that the European Union supports democracy? Or
well, there are elections coming up in Hungary and Poland, so let's see what happens in them. The elections in the Czech Republic, which have also had a populist government that was playing fast and loose with principles of democracy in the Czech Republic, the government's just changed there, and the pro-democracy forces won an election, and they've just taken over the premiership. There's going to be a single opposition candidate uniting all of the opposition parties in both Poland and in Hungary. Actually, in Hungary, in the immediate elections, where they've just decided on one, and it looks as if Donald Tusk, who was such a brilliant president of the European Council, is going to be the united opposition candidate against the Law and Justice government in Poland too. And I think the European Union has played it reasonably well. I see that my my friend Jack Bailey, who's a stalwart of North Wales for Europe, has just posted in the chat that the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, has made rulings recently, including a very significant one, only I think last month it was, about the incompatibility of steps taken by the governments of some of these populist-run countries in Eastern Europe and their membership of the European Union, the commitments that they made on it. So I don't think that the European Union has given up on the cause of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe at all. It's been playing a softly game, because obviously we don't have to expel these countries if at all possible from the EU. And I think by doing so, not making the issue of Europe itself a red rag to the populist governments, none of which actually, of course, want to leave the European Union because of precisely the events in the Ukraine today. However populist the government of Poland, it absolutely doesn't want to have the Russian bear on its doorstep without protection. So I think the cause of democracy still is still mainstream in Central and Eastern Europe and could get the upper hand in elections taking place soon. And let's hope that that's what happens in both Hungary and in Poland.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Paul, it's your turn, I think, now.
Thanks, Gareth. Welcome back, Andrew. It's good to see you. Bringing this this discussion back closer to home, one of the hills that we need to climb on the long road to rejoining is bringing the leadership of the Labour Party back into line with the pro-European views and sentiments of Labour Party members and Labour voters. Now, I understand why the Labour leadership feel the need to play a long game on Brexit. They don't want it on the political table. They don't want to express any kind of pro-EU, pro-rejoin sentiment. What I don't understand is why they're being so gratuitously antagonistic to pro-Europeans with statements like there is no case for rejoining. It's not at all likely that we would rejoin the single market within the next 50 years. And just this morning, Labour in government would be looking to take advantage of Brexit opportunities. What on earth are they playing at?
Well, I think it's a mistake. I think because the argument's a mistake. It's obviously untrue to say that there is no case for rejoining the European Union. It's obviously untrue. There's obviously a case. And indeed, the irony is that nobody was making that case more strongly before the 2019 election than Keir Starmer himself. So obviously that's a nonsense. Why are they doing it? It's because of a belief that the best way of overcoming the Conservatives, particularly in what's called the Red Wall, these constituencies in the Midlands and the North, that voted for Brexit and then ended up putting in Conservative MPs, that the best way of trying to reverse that is by not talking about Europe. Now, I never thought that was a sustainable strategy. But even if it was sustainable, I thought it was a mistake, because you never ever win elections by not engaging on the major issues. And since Brexit is manifestly one of the major issues, is at the root cause of our economic dislocation and problems we're suffering, how can you possibly get a credible economic narrative, and elections, the economy is always an absolutely central issue. How can you get a credible economic narrative if you're not actually going to talk and debate with the Conservatives on what is the single biggest economic mistake that they've made over the last 5 years, which is not just to withdraw from the European Union, but to engage in this very hard separation by taking us out of the customs union and the single market. So I'm afraid I agree with you that it was been a significant error. The reason why it's been done is, as I say, a belief that on the part of senior opposition figures that if you don't talk about Europe, it will go away and it'll be easier to defeat the Conservatives. But I think that that is the opposite of a correct strategy. I think you can only defeat the Conservatives if you take on the big argument, which is the one that they've been making over the last 5 years, is that we should get out of the EU, and relate it directly to the cost of living crisis and our economic weakness. That Brexit is making both of those much worse. It's making us much weaker economically by decimating our trade, and it is also part of the cost of living crisis because the single biggest thing depressing our national income and causing dislocations in our trade, which is having an impact on the cost of living, is Brexit.
Thank you very much indeed for the answer. Do you mind if we squeeze one more question in?
One more? That's absolutely fine. Yeah, please.
Well, Martin from Hadlech, and can we make that the last question?
Okay. I wanted to go down a different strand. I note something like only 1 in 3 Britons speaks another language or foreign language, and that the number of speakers has declined despite our greater need to win our place in the world in future post-Brexit. So I wondered whether you had any comments about that and whether the European movement should be taking a role in promoting foreign language learning.
Well, it's clearly a factor, isn't it? Part of our being half in and half out of Europe, even when we were in the EU, was that we didn't, by and large, speak other European languages. We don't even have enough foreign language teachers in our schools. It's quite difficult for most children to learn foreign languages because they don't have the appropriate teachers. So I agree that it's a factor, and I think for the European movement, which is promoting European culture and European engagement, as well as a membership of European institutions, I think it's absolutely appropriate for us to be championing foreign language teachers. Indeed, I'm very struck by how many of our members are engaged in European cultural activities, including being foreign language teachers. So we should definitely do more to support them. I also strongly support twinning and think that we should revive twinning, and not just the twinning of towns and cities, which never stopped really, though I think the quality of some of the engagement did decline over the decades after the war. But we shouldn't only be doing twinning at town and city level. I think we should be encouraging a lot of school twinning too, because there's nothing that will widen the horizons, including maybe encouraging them to learn modern European languages. There was nothing that would help that cause more than our young people, when they're at school, having real experience of another European country, including spending time with children in those countries, attending their schools, staying with their families, and all the things that come from twinning arrangements. And I think that's something we, the European movement, could do, which is to really strongly promote school twinning. And maybe we should act as a kind of matchmaker in that respect. And I think it's something that's well worth us considering.
Thank you very much for that answer, Andrew. As a modern linguist myself, can I assure you that I didn't put Martin up to ask that question, but I think it's very timely. The take-up of modern languages, both in England and in Wales, is a bit worrying, but I won't get on that hobby horse. So if I may, I'd like to thank you very much for your patience in answering our questions. Thank you all for your questions as well. I'm going to pass us on now to Jackie, who's our chair. And I hope she'll talk about the memorandum of understanding and so on, and our hopes for the continued cooperation between our two organisations. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Gareth. And it was a fantastic evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. About 44 people attended in the end, which is wonderful on such an auspicious day and terrible day, Black Day, as Keir Starmer said. I also want to thank, first of all, Joe for organising, because I know organisation always takes a lot of time and effort. And of course, I want to thank Helen for being such a fantastic past chair. Without her, she's got fantastic guidance here and setting a very high bar. Most of all, I want to thank Andrew, of course, for always flying the European flag, for coming tonight and coming very readily to whatever events, and being part of the European movement and being part of the Council and Executive has demonstrated how committed 100%, let's say 2,000% you are to this cause and to determination to try and get us back into the EU, which is wonderful, because we need people who are willing to go that extra mile and take, you know, the slack and the flack that you get in press and on social media as well. And of course, Lord Heseltine does that as well. Does a fantastic job, but also gets a lot of flack. In terms of Wales for Europe and all of the local branches, we do have a memorandum of understanding with European Movement, UK. And I think that's a wonderful addition to being Wales specific as well, because the European Movement is international as well as UK. And we're plugged in then to a very big network and wonderful comrades and colleagues across the European continent who are with us in our efforts to join. I don't call it rejoin, I call it join the European Union. Not going backwards, but we're going forwards, joining the European Union again. And whatever that might look like in the future, because obviously everyone moves forward and it isn't going to be the same as it was originally. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. It could be quite a good thing. So this memorandum of understanding has provided us the opportunity and some funding to have Joe as part-time organizer to push forward our membership, to increase our membership. So all of you on the call hopefully aren't just supporters, but also members, because as you can see, we've got quite a lot of campaigning to do in Blaenau Gwent, as well as Merthyr, or in Cardiff, or in Anglesey, wherever we are in Wales. And we do need to get out and do much, much more and engage once we're allowed. COVID is in the distant past. So what I would say with that is that we need to broaden our diversity. We do have some younger callers on the phone as well. I made my son come as well from Exeter. And I think that, and he's at university there, I think that we need to get into the universities, quick, smart. I think we need to have tables at freshers' fairs. We need to have European YEM come over. And we need to engage with the new curriculum in Wales, which is coming on stream in September. It has a stream, there's 4 streams of it, and that's citizenship. And under that broad theme, we can do a lot with that, including modern language tuition as well, which is coming on stream with school, well, right from primary age onwards. I think there's movement in Wales, and that's what makes Wales unique, because we do have a Welsh Labour government, but we have a government who is largely supportive of staying as close as possible to the European Union. And that's really important to remember. We're not in the same position as England. We do not have Johnson as our premier directly here. We do have a different government. And we do have a broad coalition. And when I became member of the European Parliament in my acceptance speech, I did remind everyone, to the great delight of everyone who is supportive of the European Union, that 58% of those who voted for parties favourable to staying in the European Union. And we have to remember that we are a Remain nation in Wales because of that, despite the referendum result in 2016. The Brexit Party were loving it, I'm telling you. So it's things like that, things that are emotive, not just about the trading relationships, but and about the structural funds. Nobody's going to change their vote because of structural funds. They're going to change their vote because of the way it makes them feel. And that's what we need to tap into. And that's what I want to really push in Wales for Europe, as well as the European movement, and pushing that comms strategy in that direction. We start with the youngest people who are very passionate about Europe, who've never been outside of the European Union until January 2020. They don't know any other world apart from that. So that's really powerful arguments that we can make, I hope. When it comes to the mutual recognition of our great societies, I think we can only see a very good future that is going to be developing. I think we've got everything to play for. It's a longer game, but we need to have more membership. We need everyone to volunteer as well to help with that, and to come up with innovative ideas and to make this a reality so that we can join the European Union again, whether it's the custom union first or the single market. But we can achieve it. It's absolutely right what Andrew was saying about inverting the political parties. There are a lot of European supporters. I don't believe when these Tory ministers get on television, who used to be Remainers, who are now Leavers, that they won't flip-flop if the time is right, if it's to their advantage. I believe they will, because they don't have any scruples anyway, as far as I can see. But we do need everyone in this fight. It's not just about political parties, but it's about everyone who is playing their part. So highlighting things like 30% less trade at borders, at the ports, and the land bridge going, the lost opportunities with Erasmus+. All of those things are emotive issues that can change hearts and minds. And that's what we're aiming for in the movement. That's what we're aiming for in this cooperation agreement between European Movement and Wales for Europe and the branches. If we can coordinate better, fantastic. And once we do that, we have a united front, we have a good comms strategy, and we get everyone outside pushing this, I think we can reverse this, no problem at all. Ever an eternal optimist, because I've seen it throughout my lifetime. I'm 56 years old, how the world has changed and flip-flopped. It is absolutely possible. We can do it. United, we are very, very strong. And of course, that is absolutely manifested through the Ukraine crisis now. We can change this. So let's work together. Let's harmonize all of our energies and all of our positivity and push this forward for the next generation and for us as well. Thank you so much, Gareth, for organizing that. And thank you, Andrew, for coming. Thanks to Joe and Helen as well, and everyone who came.
Right, very quick farewell then. Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed this meeting. Thanks for everybody who's taken part. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd, yn siŵr gen i gyfarfod rhywbryd eto. Hwyl fawr, as we say. Best fun, in other words, we'll see each other again. Noswaith dda, good night, good evening. And I'm going to leave now.
Noswaith dda, stay safe, everybody.
Noswaith dda.
Thank you, Gareth, for organising.
Bye, everyone.
Noswaith dda.
Noswaith dda.
Thanks, everybody.